After America is made on the lands of the Kure Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Well, the world's weirdest bromance has come to an end. Elon Musk and Donald Trump have had a spectacular falling out, with both men using their own social media platforms to sling mud across the internet. Who would have thought that a partnership between two galactic egos might end this way? I'm Angus Blackman, and joining me on After America today is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Angus.
How are you?
I'm good. I am kind of enjoying the news today.
I wonder why that might be.
Meltdown. The Elon Musk and Donald Trump alliance has gone up in flames.
It seems as though we saw kind of the unraveling of a bromance real time.
I'm very disappointed in Elon. I've helped Elon a lot.
And there are a number of posts, but this is a few of them. Without me, Trump would have lost the election.
Time to drop the real bomb, Musk wrote. Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public.
People leave my administration and they love us. And then at some point they miss it so badly, and some of them embrace it and some of them actually become hostile. I don't know what it is. It's sort of Trump derangement syndrome, I guess they call it.
Emma, as you've alluded to, it finally happened. The breakup we were all waiting for. I can't imagine you're super surprised at the end of the Elon-Trump bromance.
No, I don't think many people are surprised. There were predictions from the start, weren't they, that two egos of that size couldn't possibly exist in one space. And we were proven right. The breakup has been pretty epic, really. It started off pretty calmly. There were signals that Musk was going to leave. His ability to work in the federal government as a special contractor, his time was kind of up, so he's going to step aside from the Department of Government Efficiency. There was a nice press conference in the Oval Office where they both said really nice things about each other, and then things started to fall apart, and it has been pretty epic and pretty funny, I have to say.
Yeah. I saw a couple of people on social media tweet that it was like Drake versus Kendrick, but both of them are Drake.
Which is, probably a joke we don't have time to explain.
Yeah, sorry if you don't understand that. We're going to move on. There's too much going on. So Elon might be gone, might cause all sorts of havoc. We should note that we're recording this on Friday, the 6th of June. Releasing it on the following Tuesday. Who knows what's going to happen over the weekend.
And Elon's actually, I should jump in and say there's a big interview with Elon screening on Sunday morning US time, which no doubt will have some more juicy stuff in it. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there.
Yeah, we'll talk about this next week as you're listening to this. But Elon might be out now, but the kind of tech bro influence over the administration hasn't gone away. And in fact, the news this week suggests that it's going to get bigger. What's the deal with Palantir?
Yeah, so this is I have to say, a pretty creepy one. So the New York Times has reported this week that the Trump administration is contracting this company, Palantir, to effectively consolidate all of the data that the US government has on American citizens and analyze it. Yeah, it's super cool. Analyze it using AI and provide information back to the Trump administration to use for whatever it wants. Right. And this is a step change in how data is used because, as I understand it, usually that kind of data is siloed between agencies and departments. So the data that the Department of Health, for example, has on American citizens isn't necessarily shared with the IRS, the tax agency or whatever. So that will consolidate all of that data and make it available to this company and to the Trump administration.
And so why is it siloed to begin with?
As far, again, as I understand it, to protect the privacy of American citizens, to protect that data and to really stop it being used to surveil US citizens in a totalizing way. Of course, the United States government has a long history of spying on its own citizens, as famously revealed by Edward Snowden, that, the NSA was spying on American citizens at an enormous scale, and also spying on internationals, of course, doing things like tapping the German Chancellor's phone. So this isn't new, but it is a real increase in the amount of data that is available for that kind of analysis and surveillance. But the other thing that sits alongside that is the company that is doing it, that the Trump administration is contracting to do it. Because Palantir is the kind of like tech company out of your worst sci-fi nightmares, right? The name of the company comes from Tolkien. It's a word in one of the Tolkien languages for, I hope I've got this right, effectively crystal balls. And so it fits into this kind of history of tech bros reading sci-fi and fantasy and taking away precisely the wrong message and deciding to be the baddies in all of those books and stories rather than the goodies. Palantir it's a Peter Thiel company. So
he's the guy from the movie The Social Network, right?
Yeah, he is. Yeah. So he's the South African gajillionaire who supported Elon Musk through PayPal. He's a longtime supporter of JD Vance and a total far-right ideologue. And Palantir expresses that as unapologetic about that. It's done things like express direct support for the Israeli government. Mother Jones has reported on allegations that Palantir's technology has been used to generate kill lists for the Israeli Defense Force, and that its software is used to support AI targeting of people in Gaza. It already has significant US contracts, connections to the CIA and ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So it's already in deep, and this will give that company a huge amount of power. And the company itself is delighted by these contracts and this power. So Mother Jones reported the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, saying in February, and this is a quote, that we are crushing it. We are dedicating our company to the service of the West and the United States of America, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. Palantir is here to disrupt, and when it's necessary, to scare our enemies, and on occasion to kill them.
Just when you thought shit couldn't get creepier.
Yeah, it's really super creepy, and it's used expressly to enable surveillance by police to target families and people for mass deportations in the United States. So this is a kind of unapologetic fascist approach to government surveillance of American citizens.
I think it's interesting that this is kind of being revealed at the same time as Elon gets the boot, right? Like, because he clearly saw himself as central to, everything, but this administration. But really it goes to show that the administration will use individuals for as long as it needs them and then carry on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that Trump is happy to do that. He, possibly by the time this episode is released, he will have jettisoned Elon completely. Steve Bannon is making noise about Elon being deported. But I guess that focus on the kind of individuals and the massive egos does kind of obscure what the Trump administration is doing below that level, where it's using these structures rather than individuals to implement its kind of authoritarian agenda by using companies like Palantir, which are jumping on these lucrative opportunities and these kind of ideological opportunities. And that does get obscured by individuals like Elon, who, like we have to admit, are not particularly good at politics. For all his massive ego and saying quite literally today, that he handed Trump the election, that without him, Trump would never have won. These guys aren't very good at politics, at engineering structural change, whereas companies like Palantir, like people like Peter Thiel are, they are practiced at this, and we're watching it kind of happen in real time, and Trump is happy enough to facilitate that.
Yeah. And the Palantir stuff sits alongside kind of other forms of surveillance and oppression that are going on in the United States. And I know something that the FBI did this week stood out to you. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the FBI under Kash Patel, who is another Trump fanatic, has, unsurprisingly, I suppose, gone completely right-wing, has gone completely down the Trump rabbit hole. And the FBI official account tweeted last week on the 3rd of June, "Help the FBI protect children. As the Attorney General has made clear, we will protect our children and hold accountable those who mutilate them under the guise of gender-affirming care. Report tips of any hospitals, clinics or practitioners performing these surgical procedures on children." And then it gives a number and a link to tip. So this is all kind of falling into Trump's rabid anti-trans agenda, one that he deployed in the election campaign and has been happy enough to facilitate that. And we've spoken about this before. But this one really stood out to me because it's literally calling on American citizens to surveil each other and to report to the government effectively the provision of healthcare. And it kind of stood out to me because in some, I guess, intellectual circles or political pundit circles, there's still this debate going on about whether, this is literal fascism, whether the Trump administration is fascist or not. I've listened to a New Yorker podcast not long ago where one guest argued that this isn't fascism because there aren't literal brown shirts marching on the streets of Washington, D.C. But this tweet is effectively calling for that. It's calling for this kind of civilian enforcement of an authoritarian fascist agenda. And I want to particularly shout out to a listener, Lara, who has pointed out, that talking about these attacks on trans people is critical to understanding the fascist agenda of the Trump administration and understanding what the Trump administration, through the FBI in this case, is attempting to do to trans people really gives us a preview of what it is planning for the rest of the American population.
Yeah, and that, as you've talked about before, the people behind the Trump administration, the people who are behind Project 2025, you've just said repeatedly, see this as a generational opportunity, right? That it might start with trans people, but they're interested in radically changing America when it comes to abortion rights, all these other areas as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And policing bodies, not just trans bodies, but women's bodies, and enforcing a particular kind of masculinity on American society that kind of aims to return to this fantasy of a kind of pre-1950s America where, white men like Elon Musk and Donald Trump were in charge of everything.
Hey there, breaking news out of the White House right now.
It's a travel ban on certain countries that he deems dangerous to the United States.
In my first term, my powerful travel restrictions were one of our most successful policies. I am signing a new executive order placing travel restrictions on countries including Yemen, Somalia, Haiti, Libya, and numerous others.
This also comes as the president signed a proclamation suspending international visas for new students at Harvard as he is trying to block foreign students from enrolling at the university.
Officials say that the action is due to high level of risk to the United States, and exceptions will be allowed for lawful permanent residents, existing visa holders, and some other categories.
Something else that's been in the news this week is immigration. This has been a big kind of focus of the Trump administration. The president's bringing back some of his policies from his first administration with more travel bans. There are 12 countries on the list that have received a kind of total ban and another 7 that have kind of widespread restrictions. What's he doing here?
This one, Angus, I have to admit, I'm a bit surprised this one took so long. Listeners will remember that this was one of the first things that Trump did during his first administration was implement the so-called Muslim ban, and he signaled that he was going to do this again very quickly. Turns out they've been a little bit more careful, I think, because they were nervous about the backlash that happened last time. And it's only now in June that Trump is implementing this ban on 12 countries. They've been very careful to make sure it can't be understood as a quote-unquote Muslim ban by including non-Muslim countries on the list. But this is Trump continuing to implement his deeply racist immigration policies, the ones that he was effectively carried to office on, where he said things like, and again, this is a direct quote, "We're not going to let people from infested countries into the United States." This is the depth of the racism that we are talking about. Last time around, there was a lot of resistance, of course, to this. The quote-unquote Muslim ban was effectively pretty much stopped by the Supreme Court. It's unlikely that that's going to happen this time around. It's a different court with a very different ideological makeup. So this is all part of Trump's radical reshaping of not just the United States, but its presence and its role in the world. That is quite deliberately cruel. Like I keep going back to, there's this extraordinary article by Adam Serwer in The Atlantic during the first administration called "The Cruelty is the Point," which I highly recommend to listeners, and we can maybe put in the show notes. But these kind of bans, bans that appear overnight and create incredible disruption, often to families. That's the whole point. Like the cruelty and the betrayal is the point. And again, like the Palantir stuff and the surveillance, it sits alongside, or it forms part of a much broader agenda of cruelty. If we consider this as sitting alongside the dismantling, for example, of USAID, which we've talked about a lot, and the implications of that. I was really struck by a study that came out quite recently by Boston University, which estimates and tracks the deaths caused as a direct result of the effective end of American foreign aid. And those estimates sit at around 300,000 deaths, direct deaths as a result of the end of USAID programs, which, is just extraordinary to think about. And again, the cruelty of that, the betrayal of that is entirely the point.
Yeah. One of the bans is specific to Harvard University. We've talked a little bit about Harvard on the show previously. He's really obsessed with them, hey?
Yeah, he really is. And it's partly ego, but of course it's mostly ideological as well, as we've discussed before on the show. He's come out with a new ban now on international students coming to Harvard University. So we talked about that first one, which was temporarily blocked by a federal court. So they've used a different piece of legislation to create a ban which suspends entry of international students going to Harvard for 6 months. And again, and we've talked about this, the link between the domestic and the international is so important. We can't draw lines between how this affects Harvard domestically and how it affects the United States' role in the world, because this proclamation, again, is singling out China in particular and Chinese students. They call it a proclamation, which in itself is kind of wild. But Trump's proclamation suggests that Harvard was involved in research that, quote, could advance China's military modernization. So again, this is Trump using domestic policy effectively as a weapon internationally.
Well, America is once again urging Australia to increase its military spending.
President Trump and I will be counting on you. We ask, and indeed we insist, that our allies and partners do their part on defence.
The Defence Secretary saying today he told Richard Marles Australia should increase its defence spending to 3.5% of its GDP as soon as possible.
What Pete Hegseth said in terms of encouraging more spending on defence is entirely consistent with the way in which the Americans have been speaking to all their friends and allies.
What you should do in defence is decide what you need, your capability, and then provide for it. What we don't do is do what the opposition did during the election campaign, where they announced an amount of money. They couldn't say where the money was coming from, and they couldn't say what it was for. That makes no sense.
So on China and Australia's region more broadly, our mate Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defence, has been at it again.
He sure has. We spoke to Matt Duss last week, Angus, and he kind of made the point that the China hawks are winning in the administration, and Pete Hegseth at the moment is maybe the kind of king of the China hawks, to mix some metaphors. But so he's been
ruling the roost.
Thank you.
Hey.
So Hegseth has been attempting to rule the roost at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, where he went and effectively attempted to bully Southeast Asia into increasing its defence spending with a view specifically to what he described as the imminent threat of China. So this is when he's calling on allies to increase their defence spending as a share of GDP, particularly on bombs and bomb delivery systems. And he's using particularly aggressive language on China, which fits entirely with the way that Harvard international student ban has been framed. And it sits alongside a a very real increase, I think, in American militarism and provocation. So at around about the same time, for example, the Trump administration or Trump himself is calling for an $11 billion increase in the budget of the agency that oversees nuclear weapons development in the United States. So all of this is more evidence, I think, that Trump framing himself as the anti-war candidate, some of his apologists framing him as somebody who is afraid of nuclear war, were acting in what we could generously call bad faith. Trump is not anti-war. There aren't anti-war people in his cabinet. Elon was probably the closest to an anti-China hawk there was, and he's long gone. And this continued escalation of rhetoric and material action directed against China is pretty concerning, I think, viewed from the Pacific in particular.
And we've seen from the re-elected Australian government some resistance to this, right? That the US isn't necessarily going to get everything at once from allies, particularly like Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought this was really interesting. So Pete Hegseth and the Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles had a kind of meeting on the sidelines of Shangri-La, where apparently Hegseth kind of basically demanded an increase in Australian defence spending as a share of GDP, which the Defence Minister didn't outright reject, I guess is one way to describe it. But then
$365 billion, never enough, obviously.
It's never enough, is it?
Never enough.
But then the Prime Minister, as you alluded to, pretty much said that Australian defence spending will not be dictated by the United States, and correctly, I think, suggested that setting an arbitrary target that's a percentage of GDP, so saying we're going to spend 3.5% of GDP on defence or whatever, is like a pretty dumb way to decide spending. Like no other spending portfolio acts in that way. Like as the Prime Minister said, what you usually do, like what normal people do, is work out what you need, then work out how much it's going to cost, and then decide if you can pay for it. Not the other way around saying, oh, we're going to spend this much money on like whatever's available. But the fact that the Prime Minister has said this fairly directly, I think, it might not feel significant because it's just language, but in the long history of the way that Australian governments have responded to American demands like this, I think it's pretty significant that the Prime Minister evidently feels comfortable enough to push back on that bullying, because that's what it is. It's bullying. And actually our colleague Alan Beam has written an excellent column about this in The Guardian about, the need to stand up to this kind of bullying from the Trump administration.
Yeah, and to be clear, the Prime Minister is not going rogue with this, right? Like he's responding to a very clear change in US behaviour. I mean, maybe this has happened behind the scenes in the past where they've had demands like this, but this is really like overt pressure on another country, allegedly a friend, to dictate how they spend their own citizens' money. Like, it's pretty wild.
It is pretty wild. And I think that you make such an important point, because circumstances have changed really dramatically. And we've discussed many times here on the pod about how, that's resulting in a change in how Australians feel about the Trump administration. That's a direct response to what they're doing. We've said this many times, we have to see the Trump administration for what it is. It doesn't care about allies. It's bullying. It's actively attempting to bully allies. And we have to respond, really, to that new reality.
Yeah. Well, Emma, on that outburst of progressive patriotism, that might be all we have time for this week.
Thanks, Angus.
Thanks. Thanks so much for joining us today. You can email us with your thoughts. We're at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday the 6th of June, and some stuff will probably have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening.